What's the best shutter speed to use for night street photography? Let's get into it. Your shutter speed selection is crucial because it's based on how long the shutter stays open, and that's measured in seconds or fractions of a second. A longer shutter opening, such as 1 second, allows more movement to be captured, creating motion blur. Additionally, a longer exposure increases the chance of camera shake affecting your photo. At fast shutter speeds, the camera's shutter opens and closes rapidly, exposing the sensor to light for just a fraction of a second. This brief exposure freezes any action within the frame, capturing movements as still, sharp images. At night time, because you're shooting in mostly dark conditions, you have a delicate balance of letting enough light hit your camera's sensor whilst also being able to freeze action. Therefore, you need to use a slower shutter speed than what you would use during the daytime. But the shutter speed cannot be so slow that you end up blurring all of your shots. Of course, how slow of a shutter speed you can shoot depends on how firm your grip is and how still you can hold your camera. Though not essential, in-body image stabilization helps with taking sharp shots at night. For instance, if you know that you can hold the camera steady at 1/60th of a second, with 5 stops of IBIS, you could potentially shoot as slow as half a second and still maintain image sharpness. For our shutter speed, we also have to take into account the other 2 parts of the equation, the other elements in the exposure triangle. The aperture, which needs to be at the wide end of the scale at night time, means you're going to need to use a fast lens, preferably with a maximum aperture of f2.8 or even wider. These days, I always spend my time using the Ricoh GR3 and the GR3X, which both have a 2.8 lens. For my street photography at night time, I pretty much always shoot at f2.8 these days. You can try shooting with a slightly narrower aperture of f3.2 to f4, but be prepared for even slower shutter speeds, which may well potentially cause blur. And also, your ISO needs to be anything from 800 to 6400, and that depends on how bright or dark a particular area is that you're shooting in. So how do you determine what the best shutter speed to use for night street photography actually is? Well, I went out the other night and carried out a test to see if I could find the optimal shutter speed for night street photography. Specifically using manual mode for the task, depending upon how fast the subject was moving and how steady I was holding the camera, I was getting sharp shots all the way from 1/200th of a second down to 1.5 seconds. Although with some of the very slow shutter speeds, it was a case of some were sharp and some were not. I got back home and uploaded photos into Lightroom and started checking them. Sharp, sharp, not so sharp, sharp, and this went on and on. And then I realised that there is no optimal shutter speed for night street photography. It's actually a range of shutter speeds. So I have worked out that the perfect range for me in my Ricoh GR3 and GR3X is from 1/160th of a second down to about 1/30th of a second, depending upon how fast the subject is moving. And I know this because my camera has picked these shutter speeds when I'm using auto ISO with minimum shutter speed whilst I'm in aperture priority. So I think the best thing that you can do when shooting at night is to use auto ISO with minimum shutter speed in aperture priority. I know that I don't want my Ricoh GR3 to go above ISO 6400 because there'll be too much noise. To cover all bases of going into darker and brighter areas at night time, I'm gonna want to use an ISO of at least 800. Now, particularly at night time, I personally don't care too much about having ultra sharp images or even perfectly frozen subjects. As for me, the photo is more about the feel and the vibe that I want the viewer to experience, rather having them marvel over how amazingly crisp everything looks. So I will set a minimum shutter speed of 1/100 seconds, which is fine and gets me sharp shots anyway. In practice, this means that I can walk around at night, choose the aperture that I want, such as f2.8, and feel safe in the fact that my camera will only fluctuate from the base ISO that I have chosen of 800 if the camera's exposure meter calculates that the minimum shutter speed that I have picked of 1/100 seconds is still giving me an underexposed shot. In this example that I've put together, you can see that when the camera needs more light, it will fluctuate down from above the minimum shutter speed of 1/100 seconds. And once the shutter speed has dropped to 1/100 seconds, which is the minimum shutter speed, and there is still not enough exposure for this composition, the ISO will automatically start increasing to a higher ISO, which leads up to the maximum ISO that I set of 6400. One thing you have to be aware of when using auto ISO with minimum shutter speed and aperture priority is that if you're entering dark conditions and the camera increases the ISO up to the maximum value that you have set of 6400 and there's still not enough light, the camera will sacrifice your minimum shutter speed. It will never go over the maximum ISO, but it will sacrifice your minimum shutter speed. However, because I know that I can hold the camera steady at shutter speeds lower than 1/100 seconds, and I know I can still get consistently sharp shots at approximately 1/30th of a second, it's no sacrifice for me. And there might not be any sacrifice for you either if you can work out the slowest shutter speed that you can shoot at before you get any blur in your shots. Obviously, if you start narrowing your aperture to f5.6 or further, you'll not only get a deeper depth of field, which could be useful in certain situations, there's also a trade-off. Narrow apertures mean less light reaches the sensor because the lens's diaphragm closes down, resulting in a darker scene. If your camera is set to auto ISO, it compensates by lowering the shutter speed even further to capture more light than if you're using a wide aperture like f2.8. At night, I always prioritize shooting at f2.8 to ensure I capture as much light as possible without slowing down my shutter speed to the point where motion blur becomes an issue. I've personally never tried it, but if you want even more control, you can try Auto ISO in manual mode, where you get to choose not only your aperture, but also the shutter speed, and the camera takes control of the ISO. So to sum up, I think the best shutter speed to use at night time is the minimum shutter speed that you set in the Auto ISO feature. You might also want to find out your limits in terms of shutter speed. How slow can you go before you get a blurred shot? And then use Auto ISO to your advantage. Set a minimum shutter speed of around 1/100 seconds and make sure that your Auto ISO covers all nighttime bases. 800 to 6400 works for me. If your lens allows it, shoot at f2.8 or as shallow as possible. Like I said earlier, be aware of the pitfalls of shooting at narrow apertures at night. You don't want to have blurred images because to compensate for using narrow apertures, your shutter speed was too slow. And also, you don't want to have to set a maximum ISO that's so high that it creates too much noise in your images. And if you're interested, I always use autofocus. On my Ricoh cameras, it's auto area AF in the center mode. And then let the camera do the technical work for you while you practice on your composition skills and getting those great night street photography images. If you have any questions or any thoughts, just remember to drop a comment below. And also, just a quick one, please give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already done so. I would really appreciate it. However, I tested out the crop modes in the Ricoh GR3 and the GR3X. So if you want to see how to use crop modes in your camera to your advantage, then check out this video here. Until we meet again, go forth and create.